I would like to move to Franziska Sielker, Dr. Franziska Sielker. She is, to my knowledge, lecturer in planning and housing and deputy director of the graduate program of the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge. And amongst others, her main research interests focuses on spatial planning, housing, planning theory, and European cohesion policies and territorial cooperation. She has been working on the ESPON Bridges project, territories with geographical specificities, amongst others, also coastal areas. And I presume that Franziska will speak about that. So, Franziska, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So while you're pulling up the presentation, indeed, thanks for the introductory words. And I think it makes quite sense to have this presentations after the first two presentations, with Heather's presentation highlighting really some of the key discussions at the moment about what coastal areas are experiencing on the policy side, the recognitions they might have or not have in political discussions, while at the same time coastal areas really are, for many people, a place to go to. They are part of the annual way of moving through the year, in many cases for holidays. But also, of course, they are important for economic reasons and also for environmental reasons. So what I'll be doing in this presentation is really very closely present some of the results of the ESPON Bridges project, which has already been closed a while ago, but in a similar vein as some of the other ESPON projects that have been presented. We have submitted an outreach paper in which we are discussing some of the key issues in a more condensed way than the final reports allow, and I think this will be coming out at one point over this year as well. So you can already move to the next slide, please. So I'll first introduce a little bit what we did in the project. We were focusing on territories with geographic specificities, and then I'll go into discussing what we did in the module on coastal areas, which I was leading. So next slide, please. So starting from the first slide, from the first part, what did we do in the ESPON Bridges project? And you can move through those slides rather fast. They are just the pointer that we are changing topic. So what we did is we focused on 4 different types of geographic specificities. The project was led by Eric Lerson from Spatial Foresight, who some of you might know from the former GeoSpecs project. So to some extent, the ESPON Bridges project tried to work out more about what are the characteristics, what are the development challenges, and how can they be overcome, than the previous GeoSpecs project, which really tried to say something about those areas. Okay, so we are already moving through those slides now. So these slides, no, please remain with them. So the 4 geographic specificities that we were looking at was, on the one hand, the mountain areas, where you can see that they are dispersed all over Europe, but with some more areas in the south of Europe and in the north of Europe. Then we looked at islands themselves and what the characteristics are that they are having that make them territories with geographic specificities. Then we looked at sparsely populated areas and at coastal areas. And one of the things that became quite clear very soon is that a lot of those areas are actually overlapping, and that the individual characteristics that lead to some form of development challenges, either because it's an island and there's an insularity to overcome and where do you put the waste or similar, is even extrapolated when it's mixed with another geographic specificity. So, for example, if it's a mountainous area, you even have less opportunity to develop wind farms or develop buildings, and are constrained by exposure. Okay, and then of course we looked at coastal areas, and this is where I'll be focusing on in the remainder of the presentation. You can move to the next slide. So what we tried to think of first is really, what do we consider to be the coastal area? And similarly to what Heather has already said, is where does the coast start? Where does the sea start? Where does actually the coast start? Where does land start? This is all part of the discussion of land-sea interaction, and these is really this coastal stretch where we are at. And the decision we took was that when we look inwards towards land, that we are focusing on areas depending on the travel time to coast. So we would not take just a a 5 kilometer 5 kilometer radius and consider this is the coastal areas, but we tried in our analysis to look at the really the travel time to the coast, because that is where the development pressure is in parts coming from, or where environmental pressures are coming from overuses and the amount of people that are visiting the seaside. Next slide, please. So in the project, then, we looked at the different areas and case studies that we had in mind through those 4 transversal axes. So as a project setup, we were looking at those 4 geographic specificities, and we had about 20 case studies. And in all of these 20 case studies, then we took some topics that are of specific relevance to those regions to look at them in more detail. And these are the 9 modules that you see at the right side of the table. So it's innovation, sustainable tourism, public service obligation, labor market transitions, residential economy, conservation, energy and climate. So none of that being very surprising bits, but we didn't have the time in those short ESPON projects to analyze all of this for each case study and for each characteristic. But this is how we tried to bring the different topics together and give meaning to them in the different case studies. Okay, you can move to the next slide. So when we discussed the specific challenges for coastal areas, what we looked at, you can move to the next slide, is really discussing what are the limitations and where the interfaces and what are the competing spatial claims in a coast. And I've taken up here actually a citation that is quite old, from 1972 by Catcher, but which I still find really is one of the most cited, but also the most accurate definitions of what coasts are. And it's the band of dry land and adjacent ocean space, water and submerged land, in which terrestrial processes and land uses directly affect oceanic processes and uses, and vice versa. Okay, we can move to the next slide. And we looked a little bit closer at what these interfaces mean by the question about what are the landward pressures that we are experiencing and what are the seaward pressures at the coast. So landward pressures are, for example, the different harbor developments, there's land reclamation, the use of the ports itself, industrial complexes and so on. So this is uses that are coming from the sea and have an influence on how the coast is being used. So, for example, if there's a port, their ships are coming obviously from the sea as well as out, but the way that the coast is then being used depends on, for example, the existence of waterways. And then seaward pressure is considered for us as something where there's uses directly on the land side of this conjunction, and where the use is then impacting the developments of the sea itself. Okay, we can move to the next slide. And we developed this graphic where we try to give a little bit more meaning to what we mean with this, and which links to the graphic that Heather has been showing as well, about the different coastal strips, where you're discussing what's the coastal zone, what is the accessibility, where are administrative borders, and where are those pressures coming from. And this is in the ESPON report. You can download it there. This has been our thinking in terms of how we understand the coast, and our idea was as well to understand the interface. And from there, I'll now move on to the next section, really, or for some of the results that we had. So we were developing a lot of analysis, and specifically for this coastal strips, one of the things that we looked at is the relative population potential change. And the idea behind this map was really to identify in which areas are problems exacerbated over the next years. So either because there is a lot of pressure in terms of housing, and we'll get back to that, or because they are becoming sparsely populated, and maybe the delivery of services of general interest or public service obligations might get much more difficult. And we can see that, for example, in the north, as expected, the potential population change is growing. But what we also can see is that there are more areas in the Mediterranean which are also at risk at losing population. Next slide, please. So another aspect, or another part of the analysis, what we looked at were what are environmental risk, and in this case we looked at flash floods and storm surge co-occurrences. So essentially the question of what are the environmental impacts and how do they differ among the sea. And I'll just go through those because what I want to show is that there's a lot of different types of analysis where this European perspective can really give an indication where the hotspots are. And if we are now thinking what this means for policy implications, it's not just the funds from the European level where to put them, but it's also to make sure that there is an opportunity to link it to spatial planning practices. You can go over the next 2 slides. You can continue. So this is actually the delta, the Danube Delta, because one of the things that we noticed is that we are very much often looking at the coasts, but all those areas where we actually have delta regions are one of the examples where we see a lot of the problems coming together, either because they're, like in the Danube Delta, there's a growing population and idea of making use of the Danube Delta as a tourism destination, while at the same time building in that region is much more problematic because we are expecting higher amounts of flood recurrences over the next decades. And this is obviously a central question for spatial planning practices. And where we see what Vincent already said, that the time frames are quite difficult because the plans are often made when then this new information is coming up. There's no way of integrating it because there has already been a spatial planning procedure, and this is not being renewed until the next 10-year period is up again. And that is one of the things that has proven to be quite problematic in our interviews in the case study regions. Please continue. Okay, so the next slides, I'll just highlight 2 of our case studies that had concrete implications for discussions with planning practitioners in the regions. The first one is the Algarve region, and you can move direct to the next slide. So next slide, please. So in the Algarve region, which is the southern stretch at the Mediterranean Sea of Portugal, as many of you might have a hunch or already expect when we're talking about this, there's a high population density and urban network directly at the sea, with Faro being one of the biggest cities in the region, but also cities like Albufeira or Lagos having been growing quite considerably over the last decades. And what this means is essentially that there is a huge pressure, not just in terms of population that is living there, but, and that's where this next slide is coming in, it's not just the growing population itself, there's also a huge amount of share of dwellings that are having a seasonal occupation. And as you can see, this is a problem in the whole of the Algarve region. So next slide, please. So what the problem is for the Algarve region and how they tried to tackle this is really to identify ways of deseasonalizing the population in the whole region. Partly in order to allow certain types of building only to be allowed in a stretch that is further away from the coast itself. And one instrument to employ that was the regional plan, so the regional spatial planning strategy that has been developed, and where seasonal tourism really was one of the key ideas to tackle. Problem is, of course, that housing and building is quite often a local authority's competence, and also here there's some coordination was needed. And at the same time, a double strategy was being developed, making use of the smart specialization strategies fostered as well by the European Commission, aiming to develop some more slow food, agri-food, linking it more precisely to the seas, not just as the sea, as the coast, as the beach tourism, but going a little bit beyond, engaging more with the environment itself. Next slide, please. And I'll keep the last slides short. So this is the final part of the presentation as well. So another case study that we were looking at that links up to the idea of the North spatial planning in the north. Another interface that between land sea that we looked at was energy development in Norfolk, Suffolk, in East England. And this slide just shows, if you can see the colors to the top, the green and the blue, and all of the above are essentially indicating that the installed capacity of renewable energies are to a large extent being built in the eastern part, and that is essentially the East Anglian energy coast. And we are speaking of huge and Europe's biggest offshore energy parks. Next slide, please, and that's the last slide from my side as well. So what we can see is that there's obviously some direct implication and links between the idea of maritime spatial planning and the use that is being put into the sea, with direct implications for energy use on land. And what we know from the example of the Galloper wind farm, which essentially links to Yarmouth, Lowestoft, and Harwich, so the biggest cities in Suffolk and Norfolk on the east coast. The idea here really was a huge discussion of developing this wind farm, but one of the challenges was how to link it towards the coast, specifically because during the construction period it would, for example, have challenges for the tourism, while at the same time the rise of the wind farm led to new economic opportunities. And what we saw when we now spoke to the planners in the region is that instead of focusing their development strategy and spatial development strategy on further tourism development and where to put new for example, regeneration parks or new golf places, they changed and tried to develop places where energy companies could be developed, or where, for example, there could be a conference center developed to make this the key hub of offshore wind energy worldwide. And so they really tried to foster a new kind of economic use and get a little bit away from the tourism dependency. Whether for the good or not for the development, that's another question. But these were some of the cases that we had seen. And to come to an end, what we saw really from those cases is that, and I think that links very nicely to what Vincent said, is quite often it's a problem-focused approach, not integrating the different questions and weighing them one another. Most of the planning departments that we spoke to had one problem in mind that needs to be solved, and the question was, how can we integrate this, rather than really taking a step back and asking the question, what are all the challenges that we have and how do they interact, and what does this mean for our spatial planning practices? And I think that's where Vincent's idea of changing the way and the different types of tools that are existing might re-engage the discussion again. Thank you very much.